All right, let's jump into another deep dive. And today, we're going to be looking at a fascinating political paradox. I think it might even be a little controversial, but we'll see.
Yeah, always up for a good paradox. Let's unpack it. What do we have?
So we're going to be looking at this opinion piece, and it's from Black Agenda Report. It's called Power to the People.
Okay.
And the author is Glenn Ford, who he's known for, kind of really sharp critiques. And in this particular piece, he's kind of examining this question that I think has perplexed a lot of political observers, and that is, why do Black voters, who consistently poll as one of the most progressive groups in the U.S., consistently support establishment Democrats,
Yeah.
even when those candidates don't always, fully seem to align with their views?
Right. Yeah, it is interesting. It's like this tension between ideology and then like political reality. How does that all play out?
Yeah, yeah. And Ford actually uses the energy surrounding Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign as a kind of starting point.
Oh, right.
And, there was all this excitement, even among outlets like Black Agenda Report,
Yeah.
Who saw his success as reflecting this growing anti-establishment sentiment.
Right. It felt like there was a real challenge brewing to the status quo. But what's interesting is how even while acknowledging that energy, Ford kind of injects this like healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah.
He argues that even if Sanders had won, he's still operating within a system that's ultimately controlled by, corporate interests and money.
Right.
And he makes this really, I thought, bold comparison, saying that hoping for a Sanders win to like split the Democratic Party is like hoping that the Whigs would have split over slavery.
Wow.
It's like
That's a pretty powerful analogy.
it is. It really kind of underscores his point there.
Yeah. So how does he explain this disconnect then between, Black voters, progressive leanings, and their support for, establishment Democrats?
He dives into some really, I think, insightful and maybe even uncomfortable territory. First, he lays out the data, showing that Black Americans consistently rank high on issues like peace, social justice, economic equality. They are, in many ways, the 99% that Sanders was talking about.
Right.
And then to make it even more complex, he highlights this surprising finding. Even Black voters who identify as moderate or conservative often hold more progressive views on certain key issues than white liberals.
Really?
Which, it challenges that traditional left-right spectrum we often think about.
Interesting.
Yeah, so Ford's arguing there's like essentially two different political spectrums operating in America.
Right.
What we often perceive as Black conservatism can actually be quite progressive, particularly on social and economic issues.
Right.
When you compare it to the views of, white liberals or moderates.
So if Black voters are so consistently progressive, then why don't their votes always reflect that in primaries?
Well, Ford suggests that it's partly due to the dynamics of, the two-party system we have in the U.S.
Right.
He describes it as this dynamic of the white man's party, which is currently the Republican Party, versus the party that's, at least on the surface, somewhat more inclusive, which is the Democratic Party.
So is he saying that, like, Black voters feel trapped within this two-party structure?
In a way, yes. Ford argues that Black voters often operate with this deep sense of pragmatism.
Okay.
Their historical experience in America has taught them that defeating the white man's party with its history of, racist policies and rhetoric is absolutely paramount.
Yeah, so it's almost like they're forced to prioritize electability over ideological purity.
Exactly. They choose the candidate they believe has the best chance of winning, even if that candidate isn't a perfect match for their views.
Right.
And Ford points to several historical examples to illustrate this pattern.
Like, half of Black voters didn't fully support Obama until he proved that he could win white votes in Iowa.
Precisely. Or think about candidates like Dennis Kucinich or John Edwards. Both considered relatively progressive, but they struggled to gain significant Black support.
Right.
Even though their platforms did align with many Black voters' concerns.
So it's like they're playing a strategic game within a system that's not always designed to benefit them.
Right. And this brings us to what Ford sees as like a deeper issue, a kind of hidden obstacle, which is the Democratic Party's hold on Black political power. And he's not just talking about elected officials here, but like a whole ecosystem.
Yeah, when he's talking about the party's influence, he uses this word hegemonic. What does he mean by that?
He's suggesting that the Democratic Party has this overwhelming and pervasive influence, over Black civic organizations, churches, media outlets, even social institutions like, Greek life.
So it's like this vast network of influence that goes way beyond just holding office.
Right. And it's why Ford argues that the Democratic Party, while presenting itself as progressive, actually benefits from maintaining a certain level of control over Black political expression.
So in other words, he's suggesting that the party works to contain, or I think he uses the word co-opt, movements for like true social change
Exactly.
that might threaten the established order.
Right, and he uses the rise of Black Lives Matter as a prime example. He points out how the Democratic Party pretty quickly moved to, like, absorb and manage the narrative around BLM.
Almost like trying to soften its more radical elements that challenge the status quo.
That's his argument. He says they channel this powerful energy into more, manageable forms of activism and ultimately preventing, a true disruption of the power dynamics.
Okay, and he uses DeRay McKesson as an example, a prominent BLM activist who ran for mayor of Baltimore as a Democrat.
Yeah, Ford points out how, McKesson met with Hillary Clinton during the campaign but didn't make any substantial demands. He also supported charter schools, which Ford sees as aligning with, the Democratic Party establishment rather than pushing for truly radical changes in education.
So Ford's suggesting that McKesson's actions, while well-intentioned, actually played into the Democratic Party's strategy of co-opting potentially disruptive movements.
That's his perspective, yeah.
So if the Democratic Party isn't the solution, then, like, what is the alternative, according to Ford?
Well, that's what we'll delve into after a quick break. But before we do, it's important to remember that, this is just one perspective.
Right.
And it's certainly a controversial one. Ford's views are often seen as, radical, even by some on the left.
And we're not here to endorse any particular viewpoint. We're just here to explore the complexities of this issue.
Exactly. But I do think Ford raises some really important questions that are worth grappling with.
Absolutely. So after a quick break, we'll dig deeper into Ford's proposed solution and what it means for Black political power in America.
So we've laid out this complex dynamic where Black voters, despite holding largely progressive views, often find themselves supporting establishment Democrats. So what's Ford's solution to this paradox? I mean, he doesn't mince words, does he?
He really doesn't. His call to action is pretty bold. He's arguing that true Black political power requires a fundamental shift, not working within the Democratic Party, but actually challenging it.
He's advocating for what he calls independent Black politics. And what I find interesting is how he frames the Democratic Party not just as a flawed system, but as an active obstacle to Black liberation. He sees it as a party that ultimately benefits from maintaining a certain level of control over Black political expression rather than genuinely empowering Black communities.
So what does this independent Black politics actually look like in practice? Does he give any concrete examples?
Well, he points to historical examples of Black political movements that operated outside of the two-party system, like the Black Panther Party or the National Black Independent Political Party.
Right.
He sees those as models of self-determination and community empowerment.
But those are movements from, decades ago.
Yeah.
How relevant are they to the political landscape, today?
That's a fair question. I think Ford would argue that the need for independent Black politics is even more urgent now, given the increasing influence of corporate interests and money in politics. He believes that true change can only come from a grassroots movement that challenges the very foundations of American politics, including the two-party system.
I mean, it's a pretty radical proposition. Is it even realistic to think that a third party or a movement outside of the two-party system could gain enough traction to make a real difference in American politics?
It's definitely a steep uphill battle, and Ford acknowledges that. But he sees it as a long-term struggle, It's a process of building power from the ground up. He argues that relying on the Democratic Party, even its more progressive wings, is ultimately a dead end.
So, what are some of the potential obstacles to building this kind of independent Black political movement?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is overcoming the, deeply ingrained notion of electability.
Right.
As we discussed earlier, Black voters are often conditioned to think strategically, to vote for the candidate they believe has the best chance of winning, even if that means, compromising on some of their ideals.
And that electability factor often leads them back to the Democratic Party, even if they have reservations.
Exactly. And then another challenge is overcoming the divisions within the Black community itself. I mean, there are diverse perspectives on how best to achieve social and economic justice. So building a unified movement requires, bridging those ideological gaps and finding common ground.
And then there's the sheer power of the existing system, right? The
Yeah.
two-party duopoly and all the resources they control.
Absolutely. It's a total David versus Goliath scenario. I mean, the Democratic and Republican parties have a massive advantage in terms of fundraising, media access, and name recognition. So breaking through that barrier requires, immense organization resources and political will.
Ford doesn't really offer any easy answers, does he?
No, he doesn't. But I think that's part of what makes his work so compelling. He forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of the current system and to, like, grapple with the difficult choices we face as citizens.
Yeah. His analysis, in this piece, it's really centered on Black voters and the Democratic Party. But do you think his critique of the two-party system and his call for independent political movements, have broader relevance?
Absolutely. I mean, many groups across the political spectrum feel disillusioned with the two-party system and its failure to address their concerns. So Ford's arguments really resonate with, anyone who feels that their voice isn't being heard or that the system isn't working for them.
So where do we go from here? I mean, if Ford's right and the Democratic Party isn't the answer, what are the implications for Black voters and, for all of us, really,
Mm.
who are seeking progressive change?
That's the million-dollar question. And I think it's a question that each of us has to answer for ourselves. Ford's piece is kind of a provocation, a call to action.
It's like a call to, think critically about how we participate in the political process,
Mhm.
to question our assumptions and to challenge the status quo.
Exactly. He's urging us to move beyond simply voting for the lesser of two evils, and to actively engage in building a more just and equitable society, even if that means working outside the confines of the existing system.
And this brings us back to, Ford's central argument, right? Which is that true Black political power requires this radical shift in thinking and strategy.
Yeah.
It's about moving beyond the limitations of the two-party system and forging this, path of self-determination.
Exactly. He's not saying it's going to be easy. In fact, he emphasizes that it's going to be a long and difficult struggle. But he believes it's a necessary struggle if we're serious about creating a more just and equitable society.
So where does this leave us? What's the takeaway message for our listeners?
Well, I think Ford's work really challenges us to think beyond the simplistic narratives we often hear about American politics. He's asking us to grapple with uncomfortable truths about power and race and the limitations of the current system.
He's pushing us to consider whether working within the existing structures is enough to achieve the kind of transformative change that I think many of us desire.
Exactly. And he's reminding us that true change often comes from the margins, from those who are willing to challenge the status quo and to fight for a better future, even when the odds seem stacked against them.
It's a powerful message and one that I think is worth reflecting on regardless of our, political affiliations. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one question you'd like our listeners to ponder?
I think the most important question is this. Are we willing to be comfortable with discomfort? Are we willing to step outside of our comfort zones, to challenge our assumptions, and to truly examine the systems we live in, even if that means questioning our own beliefs and allegiances?
That's a really powerful question and one that I think will stay with our listeners long after this deep dive is over. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of Black political power in America. It's been a challenging and thought-provoking conversation, and we hope you'll continue to engage with these ideas and to push for a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely. And remember, as Glenn Ford reminds us, the power to create change ultimately lies with the people.
It feels like Ford's really pushing us to reconsider what effective political action even looks like. It's not just about casting a vote every few years, but about engaging in this constant struggle for power and representation.
Yeah, and he's challenging us to be honest about the limitations of working within systems that were often designed to exclude or marginalize certain groups.
He keeps using that phrase, independent Black politics, and it's a powerful concept, but what does that actually look like in today's world? Are there any contemporary, examples of movements or organizations that embody that idea?
That's a great question. I think there definitely are, groups and individuals that are working outside of the traditional party structures to build power within Black communities. Think about organizations like the movement for Black Lives,
Right.
which has been very intentional about remaining like independent of party politics, or groups like Black Voters Matter, which focuses on mobilizing and empowering Black voters through like grassroots organizing and voter registration drives.
So it's about building power from the ground up, creating these alternative structures that can, challenge the status quo.
Exactly. And it's about like shifting the focus from electoral politics to this broader vision of social change, that encompasses economic justice, community empowerment, and cultural transformation.
Ford's he's known for being this like really sharp critic of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, does he see any value in engaging with the system at all? Or is it a complete write-off in his view?
Well, I don't think Ford's advocating for a complete disengagement. He acknowledges that there are times when working within the system can achieve like incremental progress on specific issues, but he's also wary of the dangers of like becoming too comfortable or complacent.
So it's about striking this balance between like pragmatism and radicalism.
Precisely. And that's a delicate balance to maintain. It requires like constant vigilance, a willingness to challenge the status quo, and a commitment to, holding those in power accountable.
This whole conversation has really gotten me thinking about my own role in the political process.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel like overwhelmed or cynical, like our individual actions don't really matter. But Ford's piece, it reminds us that change happens when people come together, organize, and demand more from those in power.
Yeah, I think that's a really important takeaway. It's about recognizing our own agency, our ability to make a difference, even in small ways. And it's about, finding ways to contribute to that, like collective struggle for justice, whether that's through community organizing, political activism, or even just, having those difficult conversations with friends and family.
This whole deep dive has been incredibly insightful and maybe even a little unsettling. It's pushed me to confront some of my own assumptions and to consider like alternative ways of engaging in the political process.
And that's the power of a deep dive like this. It's not about, providing easy answers, but about sparking critical thinking
Wow.
and like challenging us to see the world in new ways. Glenn Ford's work is always thought-provoking, and this piece is no exception.
He's reminding us that true change requires courage, persistence, and a willingness to step outside of our comfort zones.
Mhm.
It's a message that really resonates, and I think it's one that we all need to hear. So thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope it's inspired you to think critically about the systems we live in and to find your own path towards a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely. And remember, like Glenn Ford reminds us, the power to create change ultimately lies with the people.